was a French inmate in the camps whose book concluded that there simply wasn't any great anti-Jewish sentiment at all. And the Institute of Historical Review sold several publications that showed lack of food and disease were the great enemies during this period. And most objective authors concluded that the gas ovens were enlarged later to aid Jewish sympathy. And even free Germans had little to eat by the end of the war, according to persons that were on the scene. Now, little wonder that prisoners and factory workers got starvation rations. Now, the Institute of Historical Review offered $50,000 reward in the 1980s for proof of the crematorium ovens. If someone offered proof, they'd pay up. Now, shortly after this office was blown up and burned to the ground. And Professor Otto Frank's book of 1980 used an acre of newspaper, a record space, concluded that the ovens were used to cremate typhoid and natural death victims, and greatly enlarged as tourist traps and promotion gimmicks later. He said it was impossible to have even half the Jews of the popular 6 million figure to have even existed at this period. So in view of the 75 billion in German marks that have been paid to Israel already, and the 30 or so billion Americans have chipped in, it's obvious sympathy may have motivated all this exaggeration. And today, more Jewish survivors collect pensions from Germany than were recorded as inmates in all of Hitler's camps. From the propaganda of the media and Allied information machine, all Germans were behind Hitler and his goals. Germany loved him. Records of the time, though, indicate that many Germans risked death to expose injustice and do away with Hitler. And toward the end of the war, even Hitler's most trusted command leaders sometimes tried to end the war without further bloodshed. Now, Himmler and Kaltenbrunner attempted to contact Allied officials and wanted to do away with Nazi warmongers in the party. And they set up meetings with Swiss and other European persons of influence to help bring about a peaceful surrender. And they sent an emissary, General Wolfe, who finally got word to American leaders and helped set up a surrender meeting at Caserta in April 28, 1945. General Morgan represented the Allies and insisted on unconditional surrender. And the Germans, represented by SS Wenner, were agreeable on any terms. And the surrender was set up for May 2nd. Well, after the top army leaders opposed the SS leaders' actions, there was wrangling, but in a few days the unanimous decisions to surrender were made, and the Italian Germans began to surrender. Now, unfortunately, the signed surrender never reached the Allied leaders in Germany. But in a few days, the majority of German commanders surrendered anyway. The international bankers, the Soviets, were opposed to this early surrender. And there were several earlier surrender attempts that were foiled by not only the Allies, but German generals in particular. Now, the Russians were opposed, and it would allow American troops to occupy Trieste first, and they would lose any right to claim the area. They later gobbled up eastern Germany because of this delay. And this delay cost millions of lives in Allied bombings and hundreds of thousands of soldiers' lives. You can ask any soldier there what happened at Dresden, a non-military target. Now, at the end of the Nuremberg war trials, many sessions were devoted to sentencing underlings who only followed the orders of their superiors. Many of the men responsible for higher decisions had disappeared. Allied troops and commanders had little recognition of German aims and ideals during this period. They judged the Germans on the loss of life and suffering that they saw at the ending period. The war camps, prisoners. It's a period when food was scarce and life was cheap as a result. Now, over and over in the trials, people near the forced labor camps and factories admitted they were aware of the camps and the workers putting out production, but they were unaware of the inhumane conditions to a large degree. And those that did know what was going on didn't want to get involved or stick their necks out. The 6 million Jew figure used at Nuremberg ignored millions who migrated out of Germany between 1933 and 1945, and 2 million in Russia and out of the German territory. And since 90% of the Nuremberg trial legal staff were Jews or non-Americans, it's easy to see why most persons consider this court a mockery today. And there's little doubt that thousands of Jews died alongside other camp and factory workers, yet this was a tiny figure alongside the 2 million civilians who died in Allied air raids, and hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians killed by their own governments during this period. I should point out that Hitler wanted to conquer the world. Yet in the tons of documents and books, there's no mention ever made of this. Before Allied declarations of war, Hitler only took back what lands that belonged to Germany before World War I and were illegally expropriated during World War I. Well, hundreds of thousands of persons became homeless from the Nazi aggressions. But even much of this was distorted, and a perfect example was the diary of Anne Frank, which supposedly told of Otto Frank's condition, Anne's father, dying in a German concentration camp. Yet the original was subpoenaed in Switzerland and found to be a fake by forensic experts. Much of it was written by a ballpoint pen, which wasn't even available until after 1951. Should cover Nuremberg a little more completely. Many of the former German officers at Nuremberg got off with leniency if they supplied the statements desired by the prosecutors. Now, Bach-Zelowski, for example, testified that Himmler spoke about liquidating Eastern Europeans at the meeting. And Göring immediately denounced this as false. And the truth came out later in a later West German court hearing. It's estimated that thousands of false affidavits and hearsay documents were accepted as evidence at these infamous trials. And the simple truth was that most of the camps were industrial factories, which were producing war material. Efficiency was important, and most inmates weren't efficient if they were starved or died. Later in the war, food became scarce, as we pointed out, and disease ran rampant. Auschwitz, for example, produced fuel and rubber. 360,000 inmates were on the record for a 5-year war period. Yet propagandists put the figure of gassings alone at this one camp in the millions. Now, one of the Auschwitz camp supervisors testified at Nuremberg after being brainwashed and beaten by the communists before the trial. Many of the other witnesses who refused to testify to inhuman conditions were not allowed to testify or simply turned over to the Russians and disappeared. Now, as the Allied situation or saturation bombings paralyzed transport systems toward the war's end, starvation became too common to all Germany, and too many civilians as well as inmates died And typhus epidemics then spread and accounted for the piles of human bodies that were found by Allied liberators, which you saw part of earlier here. Records show that there was little problem with food and medical supplies before this last frantic period. Well, what happened to the missing Nazis? Well, as we pointed out, many kept out of Russian hands by inventing stories that the Nuremberg trial crowd wanted to hear and put in print. And many others were set up by friends and acquaintances in other countries like Latin America. And since many Nazis were working as double agents for the U.S. Army toward the end of the war, there were men often set up in the United States. Bolshewing was an example who wound up with a computer instrument corporation in Silicon Valley, in California. And as the November 1st San Jose Mercury article of 1981 supplied the details for this, supposedly he had powerful ties with other huge U.S. corporations. Well, he and other powerful Nazis in the United States are thought by some to be planning to take up a continuance of the Fourth Reich if they ever get the power again. The Wolf's Head group, the original inner group of Germans who carried the idealistic aims of the Reich forward, and the S&S and other branches were simply extension troops of these inner core idealists. And these elitists feel that they may lose World War II and World War III, but eventually, they will eventually bring about a world rule and a paradigm. Would kill them if they returned to Russia or the Soviets. So, the British Foreign Office and Anthony Eden were well aware of these people's death warrant when they drew up orders to force them back into Stalin's hands. And Washington and Eisenhower were well aware of these facts when they voted to go along with the British policy. Many advisors were shocked and pointed out the consequences to come. The full-scale forced repatriation, though, came in late 1944. Many of the Russians and Cossacks aiding the Allies had been promised this life in Canada and Australia, and what they got was forcibly loaded in trucks and trains and amid great bloodshed taken back to Russia by force. Well, there were 3 million that never even arrived. They were slaughtered in mass graves or sent to concentration camps in Siberia. And even when they got to Russia, eyewitnesses testified the least feeble were mowed down by machine guns, and the rest were worked like slaves until death claimed them years later. And other Russians were often sent back with new Allied clothing, and stripped of this clothing and sent to work camps in rags, according to Solzhenitsyn. And Tolstoy also wrote of the Zeks, or political convicts, who died by the millions. And compared to Hitler, were these good guys of World War II any better? In our search for